Hi, I'm Erica from the Pancake Princess, and today we're trying 12 different carrot cake recipes. So my friend has a theory that all carrot cake will be good because it's basically just a spice cake and all the carrot and the oil will keep it moist. And from there, you basically just decide, do you want nuts or coconut or pineapple, and all of those things can really change the texture. For me, my personal preference is more of just like a plain spice cake, and I prefer my cream cheese frosting to be more on the really sugary buttercream side. But I know that everyone has different preferences, so I'm gonna try to keep this as objective as possible as I taste my way through all 12 cakes and let you know my thoughts on each. This cake is by King Arthur, and this is kind of the benchmark recipe because it has proportions that are kind of imitated in recipes all over the internet. It's very similar to the Edna Lewis recipe, which is also very popular. I think this might be perhaps adapted from it. The only differences are it uses a little more oil and more spices, which is the reason why I went with the King Arthur cake in this case, because I like a more spiced cake. Overall, it has a slightly higher proportion of oil compared to most other recipes. This cake is extremely moist, it's pretty sweet, it's very well spiced. It's kind of what I think of when I think of a classic carrot cake, including the nuts, which I don't really like. So if I made this again, I would probably omit the nuts, but it is topped with a very sugary cream cheese frosting, which is my jam. So overall, really like this cake. I would make it again. This cake is by Southern Living, and the most distinctive thing about it is that it uses a buttermilk syrup that gets brushed between each of the cake layers. It also incorporates buttermilk into the cake itself, as well as using pineapple, coconut. I think it has a higher sugar ratio than most other cakes and a lower oil ratio. This cake has so much going on in it that it's kind of hard to tell what the cake part actually tastes like, but if you like a really loaded cake, the buttermilk syrup makes it taste super moist. It's just loaded with like the coconut and the nuts and the pineapple, so ultimately a very sweet cake. The frosting is extremely creamy, silky, rich. There's a nice tang from the cream cheese, so it doesn't crust over like the King Arthur buttercream did, which is my preference. But if you like a super moist cake with a lot going on paired with a really rich whipped frosting, this is the cake for you. This cake is by Cooks Illustrated. Compared to other recipes, it uses slightly less sugar, more carrot, and also adds currants into the batter. The most distinctive thing about it is that it's baked in a sheet pan, so it bakes super fast, and then you kind of like layer these squares of cake on top of each other to make a layer cake. The crumb on this cake is definitely more coarse and a little more airy than some of the other cakes I've tried. It's not quite as sweet as other cakes, and there's really a lot of currants that you get in every bite, so I found that a little distracting. Probably not my favorite cake. The frosting, on the other hand, is a very good standard cream cheese frosting, good amount of tang, so if you like really silky, tangy cream cheese frostings, I think that would be a great option for you. We are now moving into the cakes that use butter as a source of fat in the cake, which is unusual as most carrot cakes are oil-based. So this cake is by Bravetart via Serious Eats, and it is the only cake that uses all brown butter as the fat. It also stood out because she uses a little bit of whole wheat flour in the batter to help absorb the excess moisture from the carrots. I'm not sure that carrot cake is the best application for brown butter because to me, the flavor kind of gets drowned out by all of the spices and the carrots and the nuts. So I get a nice note of clove in here, but there are really a lot of nuts that kind of distract me from, any toasty brown butter flavor. But I think where this cake really shines is the frosting. So Stella uses a really interesting custard method, and then you whip in the butter and the cream cheese, and you end up with this kind of like dense Swiss meringue buttercream kind of frosting that has flecks of vanilla bean. She has some lemon, which I feel like really accentuates the tang of the cream cheese. So again, not up my avenue because I don't really love tangy cream cheese frosting, but if you do, this is so dense and rich and silky that I think you would probably love this frosting. This cake is by David Lebovitz. Like Stella, he uses brown butter in his cake, but he also supplements it with some oil. So hopefully we're getting the flavor from the brown butter, but the moisture from the oil. He also uses raisins in his cake batter. This cake has a nice tight crumb. I think that it's moister by a little bit compared to Bravetart, but again, I think that browning the butter doesn't do a whole lot because you can't really taste the brown butter. At least I can't really get that like toasty note coming through very strongly, but the frosting has lemon zest in it, and so if you like lemon, this is another tangy, creamy, silky buttercream that has that nice hint of lemon. So I tend to like that. I would probably just put more sugar in the buttercream. This cake is by All Recipes and it has thousands of 5-star ratings, and so I was really curious to try it. It's actually pretty similar to David Lebovitz, except it has a higher proportion of oil and the butter is not browned. This cake reminds me a lot of the King Arthur recipe, except it's a little more moist. I would say the crumb almost verges on being a little bit greasy. I would prefer it a little less moist, but the cake itself is not that sweet, so I think it pairs really well with the frosting, which is verging on more of the cream cheese buttercream, which I really like. So high proportion of sugar, it kind of crusts over when you bite into it. So overall, I think the combination is really nice. I personally might just reduce the oil a little bit when I make it again. This cake is actually not from the internet. It is from my friend's family friend, the Pappas family, and this is the cake that turned me from a carrot cake disliker to a carrot cake liker. Like, I didn't think I liked all the mix-ins, but this uses pineapple, coconut, dates, raisins, I think, and for whatever reason, I love this cake, and so I really wanted to include it in the bake-off. This cake, like Southern Living, is extremely dense and just like full of the mix-ins. So the cake itself has a fairly low sugar content compared to some other cakes, but with like the dates and the raisins and the coconut, you're getting a lot of sweetness from other components of the cake. And it is paired with a very sugary cream cheese frosting. So again, the kind that crusts over, my personal favorite. Overall, you would think it would be too sweet, but for me, it somehow really just works. Like, it is dense and moist, not quite as moist as Southern Living, so I think that this is the perfect balance if you're looking for a really loaded carrot cake. This cake is Grandbaby Cakes, and it is a recipe that won the Kitchen's Carrot Cake Bake-Off, so I was very curious to include it in my own. This cake's recipe at the base of it is very similar to a couple of the next recipes that are going to be coming up next, but it incorporates crushed pineapple into the batter, which is something that makes it stand out. Oh my god, this cake is so good. Michael, do you want to try it? This cake really stands out to me for its really nice fluffy texture. There aren't any distracting mix-ins for me because the pineapple just kind of blends into the cake and adds like a very subtle hint of sweetness. To me, you get a nice amount of warm spices in here. It's kind of just like a really good spice cake. And it's paired with a brown butter cream cheese frosting. To me, this is incredible. Like, you taste the really toasty brown butter in the frosting. It's very soft. You don't get too much tang from the cream cheese, so overall, love this cake. This cake is by Allison Robicelli off of Taste Cooking, and this cake is very similar to Grandbaby Cakes, except she uses a slightly higher proportion of oil and a mix of brown and white sugar. Obviously, this cake tastes and looks very similar to Grandbaby Cakes, but I would say I think the higher oil content makes the crumb a little bit tighter, a little bit more moist. So I would say I slightly prefer the texture of this cake, but not by much. Another thing that sets it apart is the frosting. So it uses kind of a cooked slurry as the base, and then you whip in the cream cheese. To me, this frosting has a very prominent tang. It's very creamy. It was kind of just like eating sweetened cream cheese that's been like whipped a little bit. For me, not my personal preference, but if that sounds good to you, I think this could be your dream cake. This cake is by Sally's Baking Addiction. The proportions of this recipe are almost identical to Grandbaby Cakes. The only difference is that she uses a mixture of brown and white sugar instead of all white sugar, and she adds a little bit of applesauce. Texture-wise, I find this cake very similar to Grandbaby Cakes. I think the applesauce and the crushed pineapple add similar amounts of moisture. If I really look and kind of like pick apart hairs, I think that Sally's Baking Addiction has like the faintest underlying hint of apple, whereas Grandbaby Cakes, I think there's like a more subtle hint of pineapple. So if I was really like trying to pick between the two, I would probably personally prefer Grandbaby Cakes. They both have the same kind of fluffy texture to them, whereas the Allison Robicelli cake has more of like a tighter moisture crumb. So that's how I would kind of distinguish between the three. The frosting on this one is a pretty standard cream cheese frosting. To me, it has a little bit less tang than others, so I thought it was pretty good. This cake is by a blog called Plain Chicken, and it is the cake you've all been waiting for because this is the one that uses carrot baby food. It's actually a very similar recipe to both Sally's Baking Addiction and Grandbaby Cakes. It just uses a little bit more sugar, no pineapple or applesauce, and obviously the baby food, which is basically just pureed carrots instead of using shredded carrots. I was pretty excited about this cake because I don't love a huge amount of texture in my cake, but I honestly couldn't tell that big of a textural difference between this one and Sally's Grandbaby Cakes or Allison's recipes because the carrot is pretty unobtrusive in those recipes. This cake is also just a very simplified and streamlined recipe, so it's only spiced with cinnamon, just kind of reminds me of like a really nice spice loaf. It's also topped with a sugary cream cheese frosting, which as you know is my favorite. So ultimately, this kind of lines up with all my preferences, like really plain spice cake and really sugary buttercream. This last cake is by the one and only Claire Saffitz, and her recipe, once again, is fairly similar to Grandbaby Cake Sally's, same kind of proportions, but she adds buttermilk into the recipe. She kind of soaks the carrots in buttermilk and fresh ginger for a while to tenderize them. She also calls for toasting nuts, adding some of the nut meal into the batter itself, and then some chopped nuts into the batter. I kind of think about this cake as a slightly more complex version of like Grandbaby Cakes and Sally's, which are like straight up delicious carrot spice cakes, whereas this one you really get a hit of like fresh ginger. I feel like the nut meal makes the crumb a little bit more dense and moist. And then again, you have a brown butter cream cheese frosting, which is very similar to Grandbaby Cakes, but it uses a 1-to-1 ratio of butter and cream cheese versus I think Grandbaby Cakes uses a 1-to-2 ratio. To me, they honestly taste very similar, so I wouldn't really know how to choose between the two, but overall, I think if you want like a pretty like standard solid carrot cake with a little bit more going on in terms of like ginger and nuts, I would go with this one. Okay, if I had to pick a favorite carrot cake, I would choose two. So one for like a loaded carrot cake style, I would go Pappas Family because I think it manages to be really dense and rich with a lot going on without being overly moist. And if we're going more spice cake vibe, I would probably choose Allison Robicelli just by a hair and maybe pair it with the Grandbaby Cakes brown butter cream cheese frosting or one of the really sugary buttercreams. I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough of all 12 carrot cakes. I'm now gonna distribute samples of each of these cakes to my tasters, and they're gonna go rank each cake, and then I'm gonna put the full data analysis up on my blog. So if you'd like to see more bake-off content, you can follow me at The Pancake Princess on Instagram, or you can visit my blog at thepancakeprincess.com, and thanks for watching.